are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is about Yuji Nishizawa, murder on a plane. There are so many fears that enter the mind of someone boarding a plane. We've come to realize it can be quite a dangerous thing. But how would you feel knowing that the airline you trusted with your life ignored a warning for the trauma you are about to experience? That it all could have been prevented. By the way, I post so much content like this. It is my absolute passion to tell these stories, and I mean no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if it's something you'd like to support me in doing, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed with the post notification bell on, giving this video a thumbs up, and leaving a nice comment down below. I also want to thank today's sponsor, which is Audible. I'm sure many of you guys know that Audible is the ultimate place for audiobooks, podcasts, and guided wellness programs. And Audible is a company that I have wanted to work with for so long. It was my dream company because I have this dream of writing a book and being able to narrate it myself. And on top of that, I already love listening to other audiobooks and reading in general. So this is basically a dream to be able to bring this to you guys. One of my favorite books that I just got done reading is one called Find Her by Lisa Gardner. And this is an audiobook on Audible. But this book is basically a crime mystery thriller that's fictional. And it's about a girl who ended up surviving a kidnapping, but then to kind of heal from her trauma begins to insert herself in other investigations. This ultimately leads her to being kidnapped once again, but many believe this time she won't be found. But if that doesn't sound right for you, there are thousands of other audiobooks on Audible right now. And something I also want to tell you guys about is a wonderful new website called stories.audible.com, where Audible is letting audiobooks be heard for free for children. There's a whole bunch of different books that are, of course, more focused on children, because right now with schooling being so up in the air, and often people aren't being able to go to libraries or to buy books, this is a wonderful place, a resource you can use to actually have books for free for your children. And I just thought that that's such a wonderful way to help the community that you don't even have to sign up for. You literally just can listen to the books on that website. So I will definitely have that linked down below. And for you adults who want to listen to audiobooks, Audible is actually doing all of their Audible originals for free. So you can access all of them throughout the month, because normally you just get 2 books a month that you can choose. But right now they are giving access to all of their Audible originals when you have a membership. So if you would like to join this program, you actually get a month for free. And all you have to do is go to audible.com/McKenna or text McKenna to 500-500. So again, just go to audible.com/McKenna or text McKenna to 500-500, and you can get your first month for free. And then after that, you can either decide that you want to listen to more books or end it there. But I know that you will absolutely want to keep listening because it's quite addicting and such a wonderful way to consume books when you don't have time to sit down and actually read them. But yeah, thank you so much, Audible, for sponsoring this portion of the video. Now let's get back to the story. I also do want to say that some of these places and names are from Japan, so I might have a little bit of trouble, and I'm so sorry. I don't mean to be disrespectful at all. It's just very hard to find resources on how to say these names, but I'm trying my best. So it was 1999 in Japan, and many individuals were headed to the Tokyo International Airport for their flight. 503 of them had tickets to Flight 61. This was to New Chitos Airport in Chitos, Japan. And on July 23rd, the crew of 14 members all began to board this plane that was on the All Nippon Airways and on a Boeing 747-481D plane. Everything was going as planned. They didn't have any layovers, and everyone was going to make it to their destination on time. or so they thought. Yet 49 minutes later, this plane would land back at the same airport that they had departed from, with hundreds of people who had just experienced a near-death experience. Unfortunately for one, he hadn't been so lucky. Now, as soon as they landed, the passengers began to be questioned for their statements, and it was said that immediately after takeoff, passengers began to get this quite eerie feeling, call it intuition or that they were just observant, but a woman on the flight began to panic. She was across the aisle from a man who she said appeared very fidgety and nervous, had kind of a messy look to him with scruffy hair, but what was the most concerning to her was that he was wearing these white, dirty cotton gloves on a plane inside when it was 91 degrees outside. Around 2 minutes after takeoff, this same man would get up out of his seat, and passengers were quite concerned about this because they just took off, but they hoped that he just had a complaint about his seat or wanted some drinks or food or whatever. And so they really didn't say anything to him because they were worried that their worst fear was going to come true and that they could somehow trigger him or make it worse. So they didn't say anything, but unfortunately that wouldn't stop the nightmare from occurring. This man would go up to a flight attendant on the upper deck, and the flight attendant was spoken to and said that this man pulled an 8-inch knife on her, pressing it into her back. This appeared to be from a kitchen, just a regular kitchen knife, but she was told by this man to take him to the cockpit where the pilots, of course, flew the plane. This is when she realized that they were in serious trouble. I mean, this wasn't just an unhappy customer. This was a hijacking. Once this man gained access to the cockpit, he immediately forced the co-captain out. And this was 34-year-old Kazuki Koga, who fought back but ultimately lost and was forced outside of the area where he was supposed to be manning the controls. Now, this is when people on the airplane began to realize that something was horribly wrong if they hadn't seen this man get up and go to the flight attendant, because the plane began to sway violently back and forth, and this was said to be caused by the fight that kind of threw the co-captain about. But you could also hear screams and a man who sounded like he was threatening someone coming from the front of the plane. The man then locked himself inside this cockpit with the captain, who was 51-year-old Naoyuki Nagashima. And this is when the plane began to change course. And of course, all of the passengers could feel it. Changing a plane in the direction of which it's going isn't some easy thing like turning a car around. It's much harder. So the passengers were going to start panicking if the crew didn't do something. So the flight attendants, they began to put cartoons on the TVs and tell everyone that everything was fine. There was 14 kids on board, so they put the Pokemon cartoon on the TV, so they had no idea what was happening, and they were more focused on that than the sudden movements of the airplane. This could only preoccupy them so much though, and around 30 minutes later, the plane began to descend rapidly. Everyone believed they were going to die. Passengers said that they had never seen the ground so close when they were up in the air in an airplane, and they really believed that that was it. However, another 19 minutes later, and the plane didn't crash into the ground. It landed safely back at the airport. So how did this end up happening, and who was this man who hijacked Flight 61? The crew began to explain that when the plane began to descend, the man began to panic, and this is when the co-pilot took the chance to barge into the cockpit and fight this man for the second time. This time the co-pilot would win, and in fact would tie up this man with ties and belts that he had gotten from other passengers. He then got onto the control, began to fly the airplane, make sure it didn't crash into the ground, and he contacted air traffic control saying, "It's an emergency. The captain was stabbed. Prepare an ambulance." Now, by 12:14 p.m., they were all on the ground, no longer in harm's way. But it was found at this time that this hijacker had forced this captain to change course to a specific place. This was to Yokota, which is a U.S. military air base. When the pilot refused to do this and to fly to that airbase, this man then stabbed the captain in the neck and in the chest and took over the controls, switching off autopilot. This is when the plane immediately began to descend and went about 2,000 feet in 5 minutes, being only around 1,000 feet from the ground. The ambulance was on site when the plane arrived back at the airport, but Captain Naoyuki Nagashima was already unfortunately deceased. He had multiple stab wounds to the neck and to the shoulder by the kitchen knife and had actually bled to death. Now, this was Japan's first deadly hijacking in almost 30 years, and investigators now wanted to know who this man was and how he smuggled a knife onto a plane. He was immediately charged with murder and brought in to be interrogated, and the Prime Minister ordered an investigation into the flaws of the airport security and what they could fix to make it better. This man had also violated the hijack prevention law, which allows for a death penalty sentence if you harm crew members or passengers in an airplane. Now, they also checked airport surveillance footage and found that this man had also checked into another flight under a different name on the same day that he boarded Flight 61. Now, facing death, they then found his name. He was 28-year-old Yuji Nishizawa, and he began to talk, although he did appear very agitated and was difficult to understand. But at the same time, they were also searching his home for evidence that he had planned this. Yuji was found to be born September 8th, 1970, and had graduated from Hitoshibashi University, but was currently unemployed. He told investigators that he loved to play with flight simulators and only wanted to fly a real plane under the Rainbow Bridge in Tokyo. He wanted to perform aerobatic maneuvers and kind of turn the plane around and get experience flying. He wanted to soar through the air. But this wasn't the full truth, and they would find that out soon. You see, Yuji had an obsession with aircrafts and airports beyond just wanting to fly a plane. And this was ultimately thought to be a means of revenge. By this point, the 516 surviving passengers were taken to a hotel to be able to rest, but they also were kept there to be close to investigators if they needed to question them further. Now, I'm sure many of them were too traumatized to move, and especially not to get on another plane and get to their destination. So they were all there, and one of them was talked to and actually had taken a video when the plane was going down and showed how calm the cabin was. Everyone was just sitting quietly, and the crew members were going around and talking to everybody, and it really showed that they were definitely doing their job to keep everybody calm. None of the passengers even knew that the pilot had been killed. Most of them were in complete shock. They believed that the crew did a wonderful job at keeping them alive. However, it was found that the airport security was what was not kept up to par, especially after what they found out next about Yuji. They found that he had sent multiple letters to this airline for months prior, telling them that there were flaws in the security. He then went on a flight to make sure that his theory was right, and he ended up being successful with his findings. And at this point, when nobody had answered him, he began to send more letters to the Ministry of Transport, other agencies, major newspapers, and then he was demanding to be an employee as a security guard. At this point, the only response he got was a phone call, and after that, nothing changed as far as security. Yuji didn't get hired like he wanted, and that's when he hatched a plan. You see, Yuji had found that at this Tokyo International Airport, passengers could get to luggage claim after they had, gotten off an airplane. They could go to luggage claim, and then they could go back to the departure gates without having to go through security again. Now, normal people wouldn't be going back to a flight after they just got off one, and especially getting their luggage if that's what they were doing. So most people wouldn't even think to look at it this way. However, Yuji was. And so he planned to hijack a plane to prove he was right. He was originally going to do it on July 22nd, the day prior to when it actually occurred. But on July 22nd, he told his parents that he was going to travel alone, and he lived with his parents, which is why he told them. And they were very concerned and didn't know why he was going alone, and so they ultimately searched his bags, and that's when they found he had multiple airline tickets and a knife, and that's all he had packed, so they questioned him and refused to let him go that day. However, he was a grown man, so the next day when he wanted to go on to his flights, they couldn't do anything to stop him. It's unknown if they knew his plan, if they knew he still was bringing the knife, or if he lied to them and told them he would leave it at home, or lied to them about where he was going. But either way, on July 23rd, he checked into a round-trip flight coming back to Tokyo. So he would leave Tokyo and come back to that same airport that day, and he would check his luggage, which had the knife in it, and then he would check into another flight for later that day after he returned to Tokyo, and this was Flight 61. When he returned to Tokyo later that day from his flight, he grabbed his luggage from the baggage claim and immediately headed to the departure gates to his Flight 61. He did not have to go through security again because there was no security gate from that area. This is what he was trying to tell the airline could occur. This meant he could take his knife on the plane inside his carry-on where it would be undetected because no security had to check it at this point. He had warned them exactly what someone was capable of, and he was going to show them exactly what he meant. Hearing this, the airport was horrified and immediately began to do stricter checks on carry-on luggage for anyone who was entering the plane. However, it was already too late for the captain of Flight 61. The family of his then sued the airline, the Japanese state, and Yuji's family, but in the end they reached a settlement, and it's not unknown how much this was actually for. But prior to the trial, the prosecutors actually ordered a psychiatric evaluation for Yuji, who was now 29 years old. This was due to the fact that it had been uncovered that Yuji had taken a large dose of antidepressants and had also tried to take his life prior to the hijacking. This is why his name was ultimately kept out of the public for quite a long time. Now, the defense was trying to claim that he was criminally insane at the time of the hijacking and shouldn't be sentenced to death. And then Yuji pled guilty to the charges. He even said that he wouldn't mind being sentenced to death. However, at this point, his defense were scrambling at any way to keep him from getting the death penalty, but the prosecution, they believed that he should be held liable because it was premeditated. He had studied flight times, airport security. They had written proof that he was going to do this and that he knew that this was possible because he sent letters to the airline. They claimed that Yuji wanted to prove he was right in his theory and was going to do that no matter what. This evaluation was done by Hideo Hozaki, who was a professor at a local university. He examined Yuji for 7 months before concluding that his ability to distinguish from right and wrong was weakened significantly at the time of the crime, but he couldn't say that Yuji had lost it completely and was completely insane. Now, another professor, who was Akira Yamagami, found that Yuji suffered from Asperger's syndrome, which is on the spectrum of autism, and it's like the lower spectrum. But Yuji was also said to easily panic. He suffered from depression. And because of all of this, on March 23rd, 2005, he was found guilty. However, he was also found of unsound mind. And so instead of death, the judge sentenced him to life. Now, even though most of this was kept away from the public throughout this time because he was criminally insane, and this was supposed to continue to occur and his name not be released. However, a newspaper 4 months later ran the story with his name and his picture, saying that it was a serious crime and needed to be talked about. It was said that because this newspaper did it, many more suspects would be named later on in Japan, whether the police wanted them to be or not, because it was like a free-for-all. Once one did it, all of them thought that they could as well. But like I said, prior to this, it had been 30 years since there had been a hijacking that resulted in a murder. However, it had only been 2 years since there was a hijacking in Japan. This one just didn't cause a murder. It was on January 20th, 1997, and a man also brought a kitchen knife on a flight with 192 people. The plane landed right where it was supposed to, and he was arrested, and thankfully nobody was injured. Now, we don't hear of many hijackings of the past, of course, unless they're infamous ones that everybody knows about. But while researching this, I also managed to find the case of America's first hijacking. And I'm sure you have never heard about this before because it's insane. Now, this was 1939, which was 60 years prior, and this happened in Brookfield, Missouri. Now, on October 27th, a much smaller plane would take off. This was a yellow 2-seater Taylor Cub monoplane, and on board was 39-year-old Carl Bivens and 29-year-old Ernest P. Pelch. They had gone up at around 4 p.m., and later that evening would land in a completely different area with only one man getting out. You see, Ernest, the 29-year-old, was born in 1910, and he was known to be a genius with machinery. He wanted to fly more than anything in the world, and his father, who was quite well off, told him that he would buy him a plane if he graduated high school. But he ended up dropping out of high school shortly after, and at 16 he got married and became a mechanic and began to study everything that he could about planes and flying. And when he was 25 and officially divorced, he was finally ready to fly. He made this his mission. So he then stole an aircraft in the middle of the night and flew 250 miles. After this, he considered himself an expert and got a job with a large traveling carnival where he did stunt flying, and he also gave flying lessons in Illinois. This is where he would meet a young woman named Goldie, and after flying with her for 5 days, he asked her to marry him. Like I said, their age difference was quite large, and she was also a minor. She said no, and he ended up dumping her in a field far away from where her home was. Thankfully, she was found alive, and her parents didn't press charges against Ernest. However, the police wanted to, and they wanted to bring him in. A manhunt was conducted for this man, Ernest, who was then dubbed the Flying Romeo by the media. He was then charged when he was brought in with theft of an aircraft, yet went free on bail awaiting his trial. He kept working at this carnival and eventually remarried a woman named Frances, who ended up robbing him and running away. He decided to go after her at this time, but some speculate it wasn't really that he wanted to find her, it was that he wanted an excuse to run because his trial was coming up. Now, either way, this running away landed him in Brookfield, Missouri, where he met Carl Bivens, the second guy in this plane. Carl was a flight instructor in this small town, and he was open to giving lessons to Ernest in his airplane. That week, they did 2 lessons, and Carl said that Ernest had this natural ability that he needed to get into this as a career and become a licensed pilot. But he would never get the chance to. You see, around 40 minutes after they began their 3rd lesson, Carl was dead. Ernest then tried to take over the airplane to keep it from crashing and was successful enough to land it in a field. But this wasn't the first stop that he had made. You see, after this, Carl Bivens was missing. He had not been found in the plane with Ernest because at this point, Ernest was with a family, and this family didn't see Carl with him at all. He had stopped there because it was the middle of the night and he couldn't fly anymore, but Carl wasn't with him. He was found by police, however. Carl was. He had been shot in the back of the head twice and dumped in another field, and this is when the search began for his airplane and the man who was flying with him. The plane had been seen flying around Frankfort, Missouri, and the police called all of the restaurants in the area and everywhere he could possibly be, asking if Ernest was there. They were a pretty small town, so it wasn't that hard. That's when they got in contact with the Williams and Wampler general store owner, which was basically a restaurant, and they told them that Ernest was there, that he had ordered 2 hamburgers, and a cup of coffee, and he was still in the store. They were told to keep him there as long as possible while they surrounded the store, made sure that he couldn't run, and then arrested him. Ernest immediately handed over his .32 caliber revolver and was brought to the station for questioning. This revolver was the same kind of gun used to kill Carl, so they knew that they had his killer. But at first he tried to say that it wasn't him, but he also knew no one was believing him. When asked what happened, Ernest began to tell them lots of different stories. Now, one version of events was that he conspired to steal the plane, but Carl saw his weapon and then threatened to turn him over to police, so he murdered him. Then another story was that Ernest had invented a extremely high efficiency aviation fuel, and they were both taking it to Mexico to test it. But Carl ultimately backed out on their flight, and so he killed him. Now, the next story was that Carl was actually the one to try to fight him, even though he was sitting in front of him. He turned around and tried to fight him, lost control of the plane, and Ernest shot him out of fear. But yet another had to do with his family and the fact that he planned to run this plane into his family's barn because he was not on good terms with them. Out of all of these stories, investigators knew that they probably had the most likely one, that he had hijacked this plane, he had dumped the pilot after killing him, and then he stole it. Ernest finally admitted that without a word, he put a gun to Carl's head and shot him while he slumped over the controls, and he only shot him again because he feared that Carl would stiffen at the controls and make it impossible for him to land the plane safely, so he shot him again and kind of like moved him over so he wouldn't slouch in front of where he needed to steer the plane. He then said that he landed in a small field where he dumped Carl's body. He then took his watch and cash and began to fly away. He then headed over his parents' home. He didn't end up stopping there, and then he landed in another field in Frankfurt. This was seen by a family who watched him land and were so concerned that they went over to make sure he was okay, and he asked them where he could get a bite to eat. This town was one that roared with gossip. You know, if something happened, everybody knew. So within minutes, everybody knew of this man who had landed his plane and was going to eat. And so that's why when the police started calling around, everybody knew what they were talking about. No one knew how this was going to be tried in court, though, because this was the first hijacking case in the United States. And so him being in the air out of the question of which jurisdiction is this, and this ultimately went with where Carl's body was found, I believe, but on November 1st, Ernest would plead guilty, saying, "I just don't know why I killed him, but I did." He really didn't show any remorse for what he did, and he didn't know why he did it either. At this point, he was to be given a death sentence, but Carl's wife ended up saying that that's not what she wanted, and he was given life without the possibility of parole instead. She had said that she wanted him to not be able to ever leave jail, but that he didn't need to die. Now, Ernest lived until 2001 at the age of 91, but in a turn of events, it was believed that he was a free man by this point, even though he was never supposed to get out of jail. You see, a man named Mike Dash found that his place of death, where he was buried, was in an area where there were no prisons. His name was also found in newspapers for things like selling a house, for auctioning items, as well as being a pilot for a company called Cox Aviation. He even got married to a woman named Mary Leap and had 16 grandchildren in total. Mike Dash ended up finding that Ernest only served 20 years in prison, and no one knows why. It's thought that this could possibly be due to the overcrowdings of prison, but the first ever hijacker who killed their pilot was free in 2 decades. Thankfully, it's been over 21 years that Yuji has been imprisoned. But let's just hope that's where he stays. As scary as it is, and as much as I don't want to freak you guys out, it can happen. And I think that that's why, we have to be so cautious everywhere we go. And, just like with when you see something happening and you don't do anything about it, thinking that somebody else will do something about it, or you just don't want to be the paranoid one, that is the bystander effect. And that causes nobody to do anything and ultimately can end with death, can end in tragedy. So it's just another example of, if you see something wrong, say something. Don't just wait until somebody else does, because that could be too late. So yeah, hope none of you are flying right now. You know, I figured right now would be the perfect time to do this because none of us are really traveling anyway, or shouldn't be, to keep us all safe. And also tell me if you've had any traumatic experiences on an airplane and how you overcame that and healed from it. So yeah, don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.